The chandeliers shimmered like constellations captured in crystal, casting their golden brilliance upon a sea of silk and expectation, where every whisper carried the sharpened edge of judgment. Within that grand ballroom, beneath painted ceilings that told stories of gods and conquest, the nobility of the realm gathered not merely to celebrate, but to witness, to measure, and, if fortune allowed, to scorn. Duke Alastair Ravenscroft stood at the threshold, his gloved hand resting upon the polished doors as though he felt, through oak and iron, the pulse of the room beyond. He was a man long accustomed to silence falling in his wake, not from affection, but from awe. His name alone carried weight enough to bend conversations into reverence. Yet tonight, there lingered something different in the stillness before his entrance, as though even destiny itself hesitated. When the doors were opened, the orchestra faltered, not fully, but just enough to betray human curiosity. Heads turned, fans stilled, laughter thinned into expectant quiet. And there he was, tall, composed, bearing the unyielding calm of a man who had already chosen his course and would not be turned. But it was not the Duke who unraveled the room. It was the woman at his side. Eliza did not belong among chandeliers. That truth clung to her like the modest fabric of her gown, which, though carefully chosen, could not disguise the absence of lineage. Her posture was poised yet uncertain, her hands clasped as though bracing against invisible winds. She walked beside him with quiet courage, though her eyes betrayed the tremor of a soul stepping into a world that had never intended to receive her kindly. A murmur rippled outward, subtle at first, then swelling into something unmistakable. Names were not spoken, only judgments. The daughter of no house. A servant. A mistake made flesh and brought to stand among silk and gold. Lady Beatrice Holloway, whose wit was as famed as her cruelty, lifted her jeweled fan to conceal a smile that required no concealment at all. "Surely," she murmured to those gathered near her, "the Duke has mistaken charity for courtship." The words, though softly spoken, spread with ruthless efficiency. Eliza felt them as one feels the first drop of rain before a storm, inevitable, cold, impossible to ignore. Yet she did not falter. If she had learned anything in the quiet corners of service, it was how to endure the gaze of those who believed themselves above her. Still, endurance was not immunity. The Duke guided her forward, each step deliberate, each movement an unspoken declaration that he neither saw nor cared for the fractures forming around them. When they reached the center of the ballroom, the orchestra resumed, though its melody had lost its warmth, replaced by something brittle and watchful. A nobleman bowed stiffly. Another turned away entirely. No greeting came that was not edged with disbelief. And then, as though compelled by some irresistible cruelty, Lady Holloway stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass, "one cannot help but admire your boldness. Though I confess, I had not realized the evening called for such theatrics." Her gaze settled upon Eliza with deliberate slowness. "Or is this to be a lesson to us all, that even the lowest may dream, if only for an evening?" The laughter that followed was not loud, but it was enough. Eliza lowered her gaze, not in submission, but in restraint. Her dignity was a fragile thing tonight, held together not by confidence, but by necessity. She could feel the weight of every eye, every silent calculation of her worth, and its supposed absence. Then, before the laughter could fully settle into cruelty, the Duke spoke. "A dream, Lady Holloway," he replied evenly, "requires illusion. I assure you, I am under none." The room stilled. He turned, not to the crowd, but to Eliza, and in that moment something shifted, something subtle yet undeniable. His expression softened, though only slightly, as though revealing a truth he had long concealed from the world. When he faced the assembly once more, his voice carried, not raised, but resolute. "You gather tonight expecting an announcement befitting my station. In that, you are not mistaken." A pause followed, measured and absolute. "I shall be married." A flutter of anticipation stirred, fragile and eager. Then came the fracture. "To Miss Eliza Hartwell." Silence fell, not the polite quiet of expectation, but the stunned absence of breath. It lingered, heavy and suffocating, before shattering into whispers too numerous to contain. Lady Holloway's fan stilled entirely. "Surely," she began, though for once her voice lacked certainty. "You do not speak in earnest." The Duke regarded her with calm indifference. "I have never found jest to be an effective instrument in matters of consequence." A nobleman scoffed. Another shook his head in disbelief. The room, once unified in its elegance, now splintered into factions of outrage and fascination. Eliza felt the moment close around her like a vice. Marriage. The word echoed within her, both wondrous and terrifying. She had known. Of course she had known. But knowing in quiet corners was not the same as standing beneath chandeliers and hearing it declared before those who would sooner see her cast out than crowned. Lady Holloway stepped closer, abandoning all pretense of civility. "You would bind your name, your legacy, to a servant," she demanded. "To a woman who has neither lineage nor claim?" The Duke did not hesitate. "A woman's worth," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the rising storm, "is not stitched into her gown, madam, but into the grace with which she bears the world's contempt." The words struck with the force of something both elegant and unyielding. For a moment, even the cruelest among them had no reply. Eliza lifted her gaze then, drawn not by courage alone, but by the unexpected shield he had placed between her and the world. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something neither entirely understood, yet neither could deny. But the room did not forgive. As the Duke offered his arm and led her away, the whispers followed, sharper now, less restrained. "He has lost his reason. He has doomed his house. A scandal that will not be forgotten." The doors closed behind them with a resounding finality, cutting off the light, the music, the judgment. Yet even as silence reclaimed the corridor beyond, Eliza felt no peace. For in the reflection of a distant mirror, she saw not merely herself and the Duke, but something else lingering in the shadows of this bold declaration. A consequence yet unseen. And though his grip upon her hand was steady, his gaze forward unwavering, there flickered, just for an instant, a shadow in his expression that suggested this marriage was not born of defiance alone. It was a beginning, and perhaps a reckoning. The estate rose from the mist like a solemn memory, its stone facade vast and unyielding, its windows dark with the quiet judgment of generations long accustomed to obedience. Within its halls, footsteps echoed differently now, for a new duchess walked where servants once hurried, and every whisper seemed to follow her like a shadow she could neither outrun nor deny. Eliza Ravenscroft carried herself with care, each movement measured as though the air itself might betray her origins if she dared breathe too freely. She learned quickly that silence was safer than speech, and observation kinder than hope. "Phil." The servants bowed with precision, yet their eyes lingered too long, weighing her against expectations she could never satisfy. Invitations arrived and were declined, their refusals wrapped in velvet politeness that cut deeper than insult. The name Ravenscroft had once commanded admiration, now it invited speculation. Eliza heard the rumors drift through corridors like cold drafts, questioning not only her worth but the Duke's judgment. Yet what unsettled her most was not their cruelty but his calm. He did not defend himself before them, nor did he seek to correct their assumptions, as though their voices held no consequence. On the third morning, when frost still clung to the garden roses, the Duke summoned her not to the drawing-room of guests, but to a narrow corridor she had never been permitted to enter. His presence there felt deliberate, almost private, as though he guided her toward something unseen. "You have been denied much," he said quietly, his voice softened by distance from listening ears. "I would not have you denied understanding as well." Before her could form a reply, he placed a small iron key within her gloved palm, its weight surprising, its meaning uncertain. She stared at the key as though it might reveal its purpose through sheer will. "My library," he continued, watching her not with impatience but with something akin to expectation. The word struck her more sharply than any insult, for knowledge had always been a distant luxury, glimpsed only in passing moments between duties. "Your Grace," she began, uncertain whether gratitude or refusal would better preserve her dignity, "such a gift is not meant for someone like me." His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, as though her doubt wounded him more deeply than any gossip ever could have done before. "Then it is precisely meant for you," he replied, and there was no argument in his tone, only quiet certainty that unsettled her more than anger might have done. He closed her fingers gently around the key. his touch fleeting yet deliberate, as though sealing a promise neither of them fully understood. "Open it when you are ready," he added, before turning away with the same composed finality that defined him. She watched him go, the echo of his footsteps lingering like a question she could not yet answer, the key pressing against her palm with quiet insistence that would not be ignored. That evening, as twilight gathered like a veil over the estate, Eliza stood before the heavy door at the corridor's end, her breath shallow with anticipation and doubt entwined. When the key turned, the lock yielded with a sound almost reverent, as though acknowledging her presence for the first time. Inside, shelves rose from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes bound in leather and memory. The scent of paper and ink surrounded her, unfamiliar yet intoxicating, and for a moment she simply stood there, as though afraid the room might vanish if she dared move. But curiosity overcame fear, and soon her fingers traced spines etched with histories, philosophies, and laws she had never been permitted to read. Hours passed unnoticed as she opened book after book, her mind awakening with each page turned, until knowledge no longer felt like something distant but something dangerously within reach. It was there, among forbidden words, that she first encountered documents bearing seals of authority she recognized from whispered conversations. She hesitated, knowing such papers were not meant for her eyes, yet the urge to understand proved stronger than caution had ever been before her now. The following day, the estate stirred with a different kind of energy, one sharpened by discovery rather than routine. A footman had seen her within the library, another had noted the documents in her hands, and by afternoon the story had escaped the estate entirely, carried into drawing-rooms and salons where scandal thrived best. "The Duchess reads," they whispered, as though the act itself were a transgression too bold to ignore. "She presumes to knowledge beyond her station," others added, their voices laced with outrage that masked something closer to fear than indignation alone could ever explain before now. When the Duke returned that evening, he was met not with silence but with expectation, the servants watching with thinly veiled curiosity as though awaiting his reaction to the storm gathering beyond their walls. Eliza stood in the library doorway, the offending documents still in her hands, her heart unsteady yet resolved not to retreat from what she had begun to understand. "They will speak," she said quietly, meeting his gaze without flinching now. "They already do," he replied, his voice calm, though something in his eyes suggested calculation rather than surprise or regret in any measure tonight. "Then I have shamed you," she continued, the words steady despite the tremor beneath them, "by reaching for what was never mine to claim." For a moment he said nothing, and the silence between them stretched with unspoken truths neither dared yet name. Then he stepped closer, taking the papers from her hands not with reproach but with quiet consideration. "Knowledge is not owned by those who hoard it," he said at last, his voice low and deliberate. "It is feared by them." He paused, his gaze resting upon her with a weight that felt both protective and perilous. The storm arrived without warning, unfurling across the evening sky like a dark confession long withheld, and within the Duke's study the firelight trembled as though it too sensed the fragile tension gathering between husband and wife. Eliza stood near the tall windows, her reflection wavering against the glass, while rain traced restless patterns beyond. She had come seeking truth, yet feared what shape it might assume once spoken. Behind her, Duke Alastair Ravenscroft remained silent, his presence steady, though the quiet between them carried a weight no storm could rival tonight within its shadowed silence that refused easy comfort. She turned at last, drawing breath as though courage were a garment she must deliberately don, her fingers clasped together to still their trembling. "Your Grace," she began, the formality both shield and distance, "there are questions which no longer permit silence." Her voice did not break, though the effort cost her dearly. "The child, Clara. There is something in the way you guard her that no ordinary kindness can explain." The words lingered, fragile yet resolute, and in their wake the storm seemed to press closer against the windows, as if listening for the answer he had long withheld before. He did not answer immediately, and that restraint unsettled her more than denial would have done, for it suggested a truth too grave to be offered lightly. Alastair moved toward the hearth, the fire casting shifting shadows across his face, revealing in fleeting glimpses a man less certain than the world believed him to be. "You have always been perceptive," he said quietly, though the compliment bore little comfort. "It was inevitable that you would begin to see what others cannot." His gaze lifted to hers, warning her the boundary between ignorance and knowledge would not easily be restored again. Eliza stepped closer despite herself, drawn by the gravity in his voice, though every instinct urged caution. "I do not fear truth," she said, though the admission trembled with quiet defiance. "Only the silence that keeps it from me." The fire crackled, its warmth failing to ease the chill that had settled between them. She thought of Clara's steady eyes, of the child's strange composure, of the way even seasoned servants lowered their voices in her presence. "She is not what they believe her to be," Eliza continued, her certainty rising like a fragile flame determined not to be extinguished. The Duke's composure faltered then, not visibly to any careless observer, but to her it was unmistakable, a fracture beneath polished restraint. He drew a slow breath, as though preparing to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. "No," he said at last, his voice lower than before, "she is not." The admission settled heavily between them, carrying implications far beyond its simplicity. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the storm-dark window, and for a moment he seemed less a nobleman than a guardian burdened by a truth too vast to share without consequence that night. Eliza's breath caught, her resolve wavering as the weight of his words pressed upon her, yet she refused to retreat into ignorance. "Then tell me," she urged, the plea softened by trust she scarcely understood, "what truth demands such protection?" Her question lingered, fragile yet insistent, and in that moment the storm seemed to quiet, as though even the wind held its breath. The Duke closed his eyes, a gesture fleeting it had been imagined, yet it revealed the cost of what he was about to confess, a cost measured not in reputation, but in the delicate bond forming between them. "She is born of a lineage that was never meant to be spoken aloud," he began, each word deliberate, as though shaping fate with careful precision. "There are histories concealed beneath the crown, histories that would fracture the very order this kingdom depends upon." Eliza felt the room tilt, not from fear alone, but from the enormity of what he implied. "Clara's birth is one such history," he continued, his voice steady though shadowed with gravity, "and those who would claim her would not do so with kindness, but with ambition sharpened into something far more dangerous than they seem." The revelation struck her with quiet devastation, unraveling the fragile certainty she had begun to build within herself. "And you married me," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "not for love, but to hide her." The accusation was not cruel, yet it carried the ache of a truth she feared might define her place in his life. Silence followed, heavier than before, until he turned back to her, his expression no longer guarded, but exposed in a way she had never seen. "I married you for a reason," he admitted, the words steady despite their weight tonight. "But I have remained for another," he continued, stepping closer until the distance between them felt charged with something neither entirely understood. "I find I cannot imagine a world in which you are absent from it." The confession settled into the space between them, unexpected and dangerous in equal measure. Eliza felt her breath falter, her anger dissolving into something far more uncertain. Trust and doubt warred within her, yet neither could fully eclipse the other. "You ask me to believe in both truth and affection," she said softly, her gaze searching his with fragile resolve as Storm listened on. Before he could answer, a sharp knock broke the fragile equilibrium, echoing through the study with urgent insistence that neither could ignore. A servant entered, pale and hesitant, bearing a sealed letter marked with the unmistakable insignia of the crown. The Duke took it without hesitation, though his expression darkened as he broke the seal and read. Eliza watched the shift in him, the quiet tension sharpening into something far more dangerous. When he finally looked up, the firelight caught the gravity in his eyes, and his voice, though steady, carried a weight that changed everything. "She has been summoned." The royal court did not welcome. It assessed, it weighed, it judged. Its vast chamber gleamed beneath towering arches of marble, where gold-veined columns rose like silent sentinels guarding centuries of power, and every polished surface reflected not beauty, but expectation sharpened into scrutiny. Eliza felt it at once, that invisible pressure pressing upon her chest as she entered beside the Duke. Her steps measured, though her pulse betrayed her. This was no ballroom of whispers. This was a place where whispers became verdicts. At the far end, elevated upon a dais that commanded both reverence and fear, sat the sovereign authority of the realm, surrounded by ministers and nobles whose faces bore the rigid calm of those accustomed to deciding the fate of others. Their gazes descended not upon the Duke first, but upon the child at Eliza's side. Clara stood quietly, her small hand resting within her mother's grasp, her expression composed beyond her years, as though she understood more of this moment than any child ought. A murmur rippled across the chamber, restrained yet potent, for the rumors had arrived long before they had. The Duke's scandalous marriage had been fodder for ridicule, but this was something else entirely. Curiosity had turned to unease, and unease now sharpened into suspicion. "Duke Ravenscroft," intoned a voice from the dais, smooth yet edged with authority, "you stand before this court not as host, but as subject. It is said you have concealed matters of consequence beneath the guise of defiance." The words echoed, deliberate and heavy, striking against stone and silence alike. The Duke bowed, precise yet unyielding. "I stand as I always have, with nothing concealed that truth itself does not demand to be revealed with care." His voice carried clearly, neither raised nor diminished, yet it reached every corner of the chamber with unmistakable force. Eliza felt the tension tighten, for his words were not submission, they were challenge. "Then let us speak plainly," another noble interjected, stepping forward with barely veiled impatience. "The child. Her origin. Her claim." His gaze fell upon Clara, not with kindness, but with calculation. "There are those who believe her existence is not merely irregular, but dangerous." Eliza's fingers tightened instinctively around Clara's hand, though the child did not flinch. Instead, Clara lifted her gaze toward the court, her calm unsettling in its quiet certainty. Before Eliza could speak, before fear could take root, the Duke stepped forward. "If danger exists here," he said, his tone cutting through the murmurs, "it lies not in the child, but in the fear she inspires among those who recognize what she represents." A stir followed, sharper now, voices rising before being quickly subdued beneath the weight of authority. "You presume much, Your Grace," came the reply from the dais. "A child cannot represent what has not been proven." "Proof," the Duke returned, "is often less a matter of evidence than of willingness to see." Eliza turned toward him, startled by the boldness of his defiance. This was no longer quiet protection hidden within estate walls. This was open confrontation beneath the gaze of the kingdom itself. And yet, beneath his composure, she sensed something deeper, something resolute and unyielding, as though he had already chosen this path long before this moment demanded it. A court official stepped forward, bearing documents sealed in wax, their presence alone enough to silence even the boldest speculation. "Records have been recovered," he announced, his voice formal and devoid of emotion. "Lineage once obscured, now brought to light." The chamber seemed to inhale as one. Eliza's heart pounded, for she knew this was the truth her husband had spoken of, the truth that had bound their fates together. She glanced at Clara, whose expression had not changed, whose stillness now felt less like innocence and more like quiet understanding. The documents were presented, their contents read aloud in measured tones that carried far more than words. Names once buried. Connections once denied. A lineage that reached not downward, but upward, toward power, toward legacy, toward a truth that could not be easily dismissed. Gasps broke through the silence, no longer restrained. "She cannot. It is impossible. Unless—" The whispers fractured into fragments of disbelief, yet beneath them lay something more dangerous, recognition. Eliza felt the shift as surely as if the ground itself had moved beneath her feet. The same court that had once dismissed her now looked upon her with something altogether different. Not acceptance, not yet, but uncertainty laced with apprehension. And then came the accusation. "You would elevate this child," Lady Holloway's voice rang out from among the gathered nobles. "Her presence is cutting here as it had been in the ballroom. And in doing so, elevate yourself. Do not pretend this is not ambition cloaked in sentiment." Her gaze fixed upon Eliza with unmistakable disdain. "A servant does not forget her place so easily." The words struck, sharp and deliberate. Eliza felt the sting of them, the old humiliation rising like a tide she had fought so long to contain. Yet before she could speak, before she could defend herself against the weight of that judgment, the Duke moved. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead. Instead, he stood before the court with a stillness that commanded more attention than any outburst could have achieved. "If loving them is treason," he said, his voice steady, resonant, and utterly without hesitation, "then I shall stand as its most willing offender. The words fell like a blade. Silence followed, complete, unbroken, undeniable. Eliza stared at him, her breath caught between disbelief and something far more profound. This was no longer duty. No longer strategy. This was choice, spoken openly before those who could strip him of everything he possessed. The court shifted, uncertainty rippling outward, for his declaration had done more than defend. It had challenged the very authority that sought to judge him. All eyes turned then, not to the Duke, not to Eliza, but to Clara. The child stepped forward. Eliza felt her heart seize, instinct urging her to pull her back, to shield her from what this moment demanded. But Clara did not hesitate. Her small figure seemed almost insignificant against the vastness of the chamber, yet there was something in her bearing, something quiet and unwavering, that stilled even the most restless among them. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried. And what she said was not the uncertainty of a child, nor the repetition of something taught. It was knowledge, precise, measured, impossible. The chamber fell into stunned silence once more, but this time it was not disbelief that filled the air. It was fear. For Clara had not merely confirmed what the documents suggested. She had revealed something no document could contain. And in that revelation, the court understood at last that this was no longer a matter of scandal. It was a reckoning. Dawn did not break gently over the kingdom. It arrived with a pale and resolute light that seemed to peel back the illusions of power, exposing truths long buried beneath ceremony and pride. Within the royal court, no voice stirred, no fabric whispered, for the echo of Clara's words still lingered like a tolling bell that refused to fade. Eliza stood unmoving, her breath shallow, her heart suspended between fear and awe, while beside her the Duke remained steadfast, though the gravity of what had been revealed settled visibly upon his shoulders like a mantle heavier than any title he had ever borne. The sovereign rose slowly, not with indignation, but with a deliberation that commanded absolute attention, as though even authority itself required time to reckon with what had been spoken. "Truth," the ruler began, the voice measured yet touched by something unfamiliar, "is not easily undone once it has found its voice." The court listened, no longer divided by arrogance, but united by uncertainty. Clara, small and composed, did not retreat beneath their gaze, and in her stillness there was no defiance, only quiet inevitability, as though her place within this unfolding moment had never been in question. Eliza felt the shift most keenly in the silence that followed, for it was no longer filled with mockery, but with calculation, and that change was more dangerous than cruelty. Where once they had dismissed her, now they considered her, and consideration, she understood, could reshape a life as easily as scorn. Yet her thoughts did not linger upon herself, but upon Clara, whose future now stood at the precipice of forces far greater than either of them had ever sought. She tightened her hold upon her daughter's hand, as though willing her warmth to remain unclaimed by the cold machinery of power. The Duke stepped forward then, not as a man seeking favor, but as one who understood that silence, at such a moment, would be its own form of surrender. "You have heard the truth," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the chamber with unyielding clarity. "What remains is not whether it exists, but what shall be done with it." His gaze did not waver as it moved across the assembly, meeting each noble not with challenge, but with a calm that invited no retreat. "This child is not a threat to the kingdom," he continued, "but a reflection of what it has long chosen to conceal." A murmur rose, not of denial, but of unease, as the weight of his words settled into minds accustomed to simpler narratives. Lady Holloway, though pale, found her voice once more, though it trembled with something far less certain than before. "And what would you have us do?" she demanded, her tone sharpened by desperation rather than confidence. "Shall we cast aside order for the sake of sentiment?" The question hung, brittle and urgent, as though the answer might fracture more than reputations. It was Clara who answered. She stepped forward again, her small figure illuminated by the pale light streaming through the high windows, and for a moment the grandeur of the court seemed to recede, leaving only the quiet gravity of her presence. "No," she said softly, yet the word carried unmistakably. "You shall not cast it aside." Her gaze lifted, meeting the sovereign's with a composure that no child should possess. "You shall remember it," she continued, "and in remembering, choose differently." The simplicity of her words struck deeper than any argument, for they demanded not upheaval, but transformation. Eliza felt tears rise unbidden, not from fear, but from a profound recognition that this moment was no longer defined by hidden truths or desperate defenses. It had become something else, something larger than any one life. The Duke turned toward Clara, and in his expression there was neither command nor caution, only a quiet pride that softened the edges of his strength. He did not speak, for he understood, as Eliza now did, that this was no longer his declaration to make. The sovereign regarded the child in silence, and when the voice came again, it bore the unmistakable weight of decision. "The kingdom has long stood upon traditions that have ensured its survival," the ruler said, each word deliberate. "Yet survival is not the same as justice." A pause followed, and in that pause, history seemed to hold its breath. If truth has revealed a failing, then it is not truth that must be silenced, but the failing that must be amended. The words fell not as concession, but as resolve, and in their wake, the court shifted irreversibly. What followed was not chaos, but a quiet unraveling of certainty, as those who had once wielded power without question now found themselves confronting its limitations. Clara's lineage was acknowledged, not as a weapon to seize the throne, but as a truth that demanded recognition without domination. The balance of power did not collapse, but it changed, bending toward something more measured, more aware of the lives it governed. Eliza watched as the world that had once rejected her reshaped itself in the presence of the very child it had sought to dismiss. When the court at last began to disperse, its grandeur seemed altered, no longer untouchable, but human in its imperfection. The Duke turned to Eliza, his composure easing for the first time since they had entered. "It is done," he said quietly, though the words carried neither triumph nor relief, only the quiet acknowledgment of a path irrevocably chosen. Eliza met his gaze, and in that moment, the distance that had once defined their union dissolved entirely, replaced by something far deeper than circumstance had ever intended. "They laughed at us once," she murmured, her voice softened by memory and wonder alike. The echo of that ballroom, of whispered scorn and unveiled cruelty, lingered between them, now transformed by all that had followed. The Duke's lips curved faintly, though his eyes remained steady upon hers. "Yes," he replied, his voice low, imbued with a quiet strength that no longer required defiance. "And now they listen." The simplicity of his words carried the weight of everything they had endured and everything they had become. As they stepped from the court into the pale light of morning, Clara walked between them, her small hand held firmly within theirs, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of what had been risked and what had been gained. Beyond the palace, the kingdom stirred, unaware that it had shifted, that something fundamental had changed within its unseen foundations. Yet change, Eliza understood, did not require immediate recognition to be real. And as the first bells of morning rang across the distant city, their sound clear and resonant, she felt not the burden of what lay ahead, but the quiet certainty that the life she had once feared would break her had instead remade her. Not into what the world demanded, but into something it could no longer deny.